Nowadays, we all sort of use social media and other technologies. And there is a tendency or trend that claims that ICTs or technologies actually empower people. So I want to look at the evidence of that particular statement. Is it true that ICTs or technologies do empower us to become better citizens or be more vocal in different situations? Looking at the history of the ICTs in the last 20 years, we can see 4 different phases. The first one around 1991, 92, when the internet became sort of the fashionable thing to do. Back then, if you recall, there was basically email. And later on in 1993, we saw the emergence of the World Wide Web, which I think make a big difference for many, many people, because we finally had a graphical interface to look for information on a virtual space. This first wave didn't actually quite get to developing countries for obvious reasons, one being connectivity. It was very expensive to connect countries to the internet. By 1996, we saw the second wave, 96, 97 more or less, where the applications of internet, like e-commerce and later on e-government, became popular. We all recall the what I call the e-commerce revolution of 1998, 1999, where companies like Cisco and many other companies started using internet websites to either promote products or sell products. This second phase crashed basically in 2000 with the now infamous .com crash in March of 2000. And at that point, we saw a backlash against ICT for development by many donors who sort of pulled out of the field. After a few years, we saw a third wave emerge, which is now what we call the Web 2.0, or the social net media era, where we see ICT or internet applications which actually give us users a lot of power. So it's content driven by us, the users. It's massive. I can reach a lot of people in 1 second, and probably billions of people can actually see my emails or messages or my postings. And it's becoming, or has become the sort of the I would call it the hype for the young generation. So people who are probably under 25 have not lived the other 2 phases, but they're actually living this sort of social media phase. And empowerment here is becoming more evident. And finally, we have the fourth and final wave, which is the mobile technologies, which many people didn't see coming. And mobiles, compared to internet, Facebook or Twitter, is actually massive. So if you look at the numbers, we have around 1 billion people using Facebook or Twitter, more or less. We have 2.5 billion on the internet, and we have 6 billion on mobiles. Of the 6 billion, around 80% are in developing countries. So for UNDP, this is important, that we have sort of access, people in poor countries have access to a device who can probably empower them to become citizens or have voice. Now, what these 4 waves have in common is that they all claim that they empower us. So the question is that the case? And what is the difference? There's some evidence that people who support such a view bring forward, and that's of course the so-called Arab Spring. So we heard about the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution in those countries, Egypt, Tunisia, later on maybe Libya, maybe Syria nowadays. And there are many studies actually happening on this. And so the question is it really that what happened due to Facebook? And there's a huge debate on this. Now, if you look at the evidence and think about things such as, for example, language or accessibility, in, say, Egypt, we know that in Egypt, when the Arab Spring happened, only 4% of people actually have internet access, and 0.04% were in Facebook. So it's difficult to claim that such tools mobilize millions of people in Egypt. And as you know, the language of these tools is mostly English, and people in Egypt don't speak English; they speak Arabic. So there's some doubts as to how this actually works. Second thing that people assume is that people or citizens are actually waiting to be mobilized, and that's not the case. I mean, you need to have some grievances to go out in the streets. And if you look at developed countries, what you find is that people in the north, they don't want to be part of anything. They're actually quite happy. They have good economic status. They don't need to be activists to do things. So there's no incentive to participate in things. But in developing countries, it could be the opposite. But on the other hand, people are not waiting to be mobilized. They need an incentive. So as we see it in UNDP, these tools do not mobilize people, but they provide a channel of communication that could lead to mobilization. So if you look back at the fourth wave that I mentioned before, and look at the penetration in developing countries, we see that people at the local level can actually be part of something. And there's evidence that today that crowdsourcing, and we call it crowdsourcing, but people actually report information from different points, is useful. Why is that important? Because the incentive for me to participate is actually there. I can see my own reality. For example, I can report gender violence. I can report, muggings. I can report environmental issues. So I'm reporting things that I actually care about. So the incentive for me is direct. I have a stake to be part of this, which doesn't exist when you have these other sort of more global networks. So I think crowdsourcing gives an example on how people do have a stake in local issues. So the evidence is that when you localize ICTs and access to technology and channels of communication, people probably have more interest in being part of something and having their voices heard by others, including local governments. However, that is not enough to promote what we call democratic governance. What's missing in all this discussion, in addition to the issue of automatic participation by ICTs, is the question is who's listening. So today we have tools that allow us to express our voices, and including people who before didn't have any chance to say anything. Now, if you can send an SMS to someone, and the question is what happened to that message. If we all agree, for example, in our community, the key thing is the lack of a health center. Who's listening? Is somebody going to take action? So what's really missing in this equation is what I call the supply side. We have tools that empower us to have voice as networks, as group of citizens, as communities, but we also need to ensure that those who make decisions are listening and take action. Now, if you look at most developing countries, there is no mechanism that requires that policy making decisions actually are being or require that our voices are part of the process. So what we need to do, I think, from the point of view of citizens, of participation, of democratic governance, is to create those mechanisms, to make sure that institutions who use resources from either donors or UNDP or the UN system or taxes actually have a requirement to have people's participation when such decisions are made to invest money in X or Y priority. And that's not happening. We have lots of examples in developing countries of participation. And usually it's done because some sort of nice governor or major or politician wants to listen to us. But once they move on, this mechanism is gone. So we need to institutionalize such mechanism. And maybe crowdsourcing towards that particular goal can help us open that door. So to conclude, ICTs do give us more communication channels to express our voices if we want to be activists in development. But we also need to ensure that on the supply side, on the government side, on the institutional side, there are also mechanisms that require that our voices count for something.